Another edition of Talks with the Executive Director. My name is Matt Lawson. I was the Executive Director with the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula. So apologize about the confusion yesterday with our technical difficulties. It seems that Facebook is doing a new version of Facebook Live that doesn't support the cameras in most of our laptops. So therefore, we ran into this issue where I could not get my video to work. So we are looking to move forward now. They did put a little patch on it, so it allows me to use the previous version. So thus I'm here today on Friday. So thanks again for joining us. A couple things I want to talk about today. One of the big things that came out in the last week is the governor has issued an executive order related to opening of museums and such. One of the real concerns we had as a museum here in Missoula is that the previous directive that he issued didn't reference arts and culture museums at all. So, but per the governor's order, museums are permitted to begin to start opening on May 15th, which would be today. I will tell you, we're not open yet. One of the things in the order that I think we all need to address as museums is there are a whole series of guidelines and such that we have. When we do open for business again, we're not going to open in the same way that we have in the past. Things are going to look a little different for the time being. A couple of the things you're going to notice when you do come back to the museum, and we're tentatively planning for a June 1st opening for the public, but that is all dependent upon some of these things I'm going to talk about here in a second, as far as what we need to do as far as making the museum the most safe for our staff, our guests, and our volunteers. So some of the things you're going to notice is that we are going to limit the number of people that are in the museum at a given time. Our museum is a pretty enclosed space. So we want to make sure that we're being safe and we're giving people the ability to socially distance so that we can help to combat the pandemic. So we will be limiting the number of people. We are putting a pretty rigorous cleaning schedule into the exhibit now. So we will be looking to sanitize and clean every couple hours. We'll be wiping down surfaces on a more regular basis than that. We're also in the process of trying to acquire some hand sanitizer units, some things that can be posted both inside the building and outside the building. With some of our outbuildings to give people access to those things. When you come back, you will notice that all the staff and anyone else that's working the front desk you would interact with is going to be wearing masks. It's kind of a weird world we've come to live in, but I think the key here is that we want to be safe and we want to keep you folks safe when you come out to visit us. So it's unusual, it's different, and but we're going to be moving forward that direction and keeping everybody safe. So another thing I wanted to talk about that I'm kind of excited about here is that this weekend we are actually breaking ground on the pole barn for our locomotive. So some of you may remember we've been looking at restoring our historic Willamette locomotive. I know I got some flack. I pronounced it wrong. It's one of those mental blocks I have about the name of it, but is it a Willamette, not a Willamette? So we're looking to build that locomotive pole barn. Essentially, when we started looking at the restoration process, one of the experts we met with told us that before we can actually preserve the locomotive and do the restoration, it doesn't make any sense to do that and then have it be exposed to our Montana winters. So we looked at some different options and we partnered with a local retired contractor by the name of Mark Buck. And Mark has been an incredible help. He helped me put together a budget for the pole barn. It's going to be a pretty significant structure that's going to be built on our property. When we originally got some estimates for it to have private contractors do it, we were looking at close to a $70,000 building. But by working with Mark and working with our great volunteers in our community, we've gotten the cost down for that building to $27,000. And that's essentially just materials and any equipment we need to rent to put it up. So it's exciting that we've been able to half that cost or more. And now through our annual fund campaign, which we had at the end of the year, we were able to raise the money for that building. And the great part about that is not only did we raise the $27,000 we needed to build the building or buy the supplies, we also raised a couple thousand more than that. So that money will now be transferred directly over to the physical restoration of the train, which is great. And then, of course, the Missoula Gives event that we had would have been 2 weeks ago now. Missoula Gives, all the funds we raised for that will also go directly towards the train. So now we not only have raised the funding for the building, but we also are sitting on about 18,000 of the, say, 90,000 or so that we need to raise for the restoration that's already there in place so that we can go ahead and start moving forward with the restoration as soon as we can get the pole barn up. So We went through the process with the City of Missoula. We went through the Historic Preservation Commission. All of the permits have been secured. All of those are in place now. We've started ordering supplies for the pole barn. And like I said, they have a work party scheduled for tomorrow morning, and we're hoping to break ground. And we'd love to see that building up and ready to go and protecting the locomotive, hopefully by the end of the summer. So, of course, some of this will depend on our current situation and working in groups and those kind of things, but we're hopeful that that'll get up and get done. So it's always wonderful when we do make an ask and ask you to support us at the Historical Museum to be able to come through and be able to show you the progress of that. So hopefully at some of these later dates, we'll be doing one of the talks with the director. I can maybe take you out and we can kind of track the progress of the pole barn as we do it. So moving forward, I would like to do a little history tidbit. So one of the things I've really enjoyed, and we've had a couple people have commented on, is every week I do kind of a short history of something related to Missoula or Fort Missoula. Today, I actually want to cover a gentleman by the name of Eugene Ely, who is an aviation pioneer who wasn't from Missoula, but he does have a pretty interesting connection here to Missoula. So for this history tidbit today, we're going to go all the way back to 1911 when Eugene Ely thrilled the residents of Missoula in his Curtiss biplane. But before we get there, we have to go back a little further to kind of understand who Eugene Ely was and where he came from. He was actually born in Williamsburg, Iowa in 1886 and grew up in the neighboring town of Davenport, Iowa. In 1901, he finished the 8th grade, and although there's some kind of conflicting sources out there saying that he may have gone on further, there's really no verification that he ever had any more than an 8th grade education. We know that about 1904, Ely had his first job. He was hired by a gentleman named Father Smith, a Catholic priest in Cosgrove, Iowa, and he worked for Father Smith as a chauffeur. So one of the things that what I read that the two men hit it off so well was because they both had a little bit of a love affair with driving fast in the car, and Ely was known to have a lead foot, so he and Father Smith hit it off great. There are many stories out there of he and Father Smith speeding through the Iowa countryside and the priest's Franklin touring car, which was bright red. In 1906, Ely had another little brush with history. We know that he was in San Francisco, where he lived through the devastating 1906 earthquake that would eventually level about 80% of the city and kill over 3,000 people. While he lived there in San Francisco, he indulged his passion for racing and also worked in automobile sales. He also met the love of his life while he was there, a woman by the name of Mabel Hall, and the two were married on August 7th, 1907. Ely would have been 21, and Mabel was just 17. So further moves would take that young couple to Nevada City, California in 1909, and then into Portland, Oregon in 1910. In Portland, Ely worked for a salesman by the name of E. Henry Wemme, and it was Wemme that first introduced Ely to airplanes. So Wemme was kind of an early enthusiast, and he purchased a 4-cylinder biplane and also acquired the franchise rights to sell them in the Pacific Northwest. Unfortunately, although Wemme was interested, he wasn't very good at flying, so he didn't feel real comfortable. So he offered Ely the chance. And of course, Eugene Ely, plane couldn't have been much different than a car. And if he could drive one, why not the other? So he decided to take it up. He hopped into Wemme's plane and he proceeded to crash it. He did live through the crash. He didn't have many injuries, but the plane was in pretty bad shape. So Ely felt kind of bad, so he agreed to buy the wreckage of the plane off of Wemme and began to work on fixing it. It took him a couple months, but he was eventually successful in making repairs and in learning to fly the plane. With this being kind of his own plane, he continued to practice, got to be pretty well known as a talented flyer, and he started to participate in all these interesting flying exhibitions. He also started working with another aviation pioneer, a gentleman by the name of Glenn Curtiss. And Curtiss was really important in the early history of flying. He was actually the founder of the Curtiss Aeroplane and Motor Company. So Ely's first exhibition working for Curtiss was in July of 1910 in Winnipeg. Just a few months later, in October of 1910, Ely officially received his license from the Aero Club of America, and his was pilot license number 17. Um, After receiving the license, Ely and Curtis worked all over the United States, and they also worked with the U.S. Navy. And where Ely kind of steps into the pages of the history book is on November 10th, 1910. He made the first successful launch from the deck of a ship. To make the takeoff, the Navy constructed a special platform in the USS Birmingham, which was a light cruiser. Now, the takeoff almost failed because the story was that Ely's plane went sliding down the platform and then went off the platform and essentially plummeted towards the ocean. The very last second he pulled up, the wheels skimmed across the water and his goggles got soaked with spray, but he managed to get the plane airborne. Just 2 months after that, he had another first. He was the first person to complete a successful landing on the deck of a plane, and he did that on the deck of the USS Pennsylvania. And this was only made possible through the use of what was called a tailhook. Now, if everybody remembers their 80s movies and watching Top Gun, you remember how the planes would land on the aircraft carriers, and they would connect with that tailhook, and that would help to slow them down. What's interesting, and they don't mention this in Top Gun, the gentleman that invented this tailhook system was actually a combination circus performer and aviator by the name of Hugh Robinson. So where we get to our Missoula point of the story here is on July 28, 1911, Eugene Ely came to Missoula, or even Fort Missoula, for a flying exhibition. For this show that he was going to put on, we had over 3,000 people that headed out to the fort to watch it. Special trains ran from down the Bitterroot to accommodate passengers, and the Missoula Streetcar Company even got involved, offering a special fare where it was a round-trip ticket to Fort Missoula and a ticket for admission to the exhibition for only 70 cents. So Ely took off from the baseball field and what was then the recently completed parade grounds. And this is the area in front of Officers Row that we know today, just behind Heritage Hall and Building T1. So he took off from that area, which was a baseball field at that point, and of course thrilled the crowd. At the time, being 1911, this was probably the first opportunity that many Missoulians ever had to see an airplane in action. Just a few months after Ely's successful flight in Missoula, unfortunately, his life ended in tragedy. On October 19th, so just a few months later of 1911, he was attempting to pull out of a dive in Macon, Georgia during an exhibition, and his plane crashed. Although he was able to get clear of the wreckage, Ely broke his neck in the crash and died just a few minutes later. So 3 days after his tragic death, and what would have been Ely's 25th birthday, his body arrived in his hometown of Williamsburg, Iowa for burial. He was eventually posthumously awarded a Flying Cross in February 1933 for his contribution to the development of aviation in the U.S. Navy. Today, there is a historical marker that sits at Newport News, Virginia, and this is within sight of where Ely made his first historic flight, taking off from the deck of the USS Birmingham. So kind of a fun little story. I enjoy that one, and we do have a lot of really fun pictures of Eugene Ely and taking off, and some of the pictures of his exhibition at Fort Missoula. So I'll see if I can get some of the other folks in collections to maybe share that with us, so we can take a look at some of the pictures as well too. So I think that's probably going to do it for today. I don't see any questions from anybody, but thanks again for taking the time to join me today. Hopefully you're enjoying the historical tidbits and the quick updates on the museum. Sorry again for the confusion with this past yesterday, and hopefully Facebook decides not to change their metrics again so that I struggle next week. But hope to see everybody next week. We'll go back to our normal time at 2:30 on Thursday afternoon, and we will catch you then. Until then, have a great week.